Welcome to Forgotten Not Forsaken, a podcast of Christian Witness to Israel, North America. My name's Greg Kite. I'm the media director here at CWI-NA, and I have the pleasure of talking this afternoon with Phil Pockras, the Reverend Phil Pockras, who is a pastor at Bell Center Reformed Presbyterian Church in Ohio. How are you doing today, Phil?
I'm well, thank you, Greg. Thank you for letting me come on.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. I'm really excited about just hearing your story because I've heard a lot about it. Stephen Atkinson, who is our director of ministry, has chatted with me a little bit here and there about some of your background, and then just before we started recording, you gave me a little bit of it as well, and so I know it's going to be an interesting story, and I just wanted to kind of give you a platform in this brief 20 to 30 minutes where we can just kind of talk about your story, your whole family's story, going all the way back as far as you would think is reasonable to explain, and that would be beneficial for our hearers. So why don't you just kind of go ahead and start telling us about yourself?
All right, very quickly, I am approaching 70 years old, married, 2 adult sons, 2 adult daughters-in-law, 2 grandkids. One is living, one is with the Lord. I have been the pastor here in Bell Center at the RP Church since 1985, and that's the current situation. Stephen was kind of interested in my talking about my background. I am of Jewish ancestry on my father's side. My father is a Levite. Well, yeah, I should say was. He's with the Lord now. But I am Philip, son of Lawrence, son of Harry, son of Ephraim, son of Reb Pincus the Levite. And Pincus, my great-great-grandfather, was from Zlatopol in the Ukraine. And my great-great-grandfather, actually great-great-grandparents, and my great-grandparents, as well as my grandparents, are buried in northeastern Pennsylvania in the Jewish section of the Oak Street Cemetery in Towanda, Pennsylvania. Real quickly, my great-grandparents left what was then the Russian Empire in 1891, escaping pogroms. My grandfather was their youngest kid. He and his next older sister were not born in what's now Ukraine, but in London, in the East End, I guess you'd say slums. And they came to America at different times. I know that my grandfather and my great-grandmother, and I believe a couple of other siblings, came over in 1908 on the Mauritania in steerage and ended up in Towanda, where my great-great-grandfather was, and my great-grandfather. And they started a business that was kind of a continuation of what they had in Zlatopol. My great-grandfather was a grocer. He was well off enough. He didn't have a push cart. He had his own store and started up something similar in Towanda, Pennsylvania. It's a business that still exists. My grandfather's family was very much like Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof, except instead of being a dairy operation, it was groceries. And as I say, great-grandfather had a store, not just a push cart. And they left in 1891, not 1905. My grandfather wanted to go to engineering school and did at the University of Cincinnati. And while he was there, he changed his name. It had been Harris Pockras, Pokrass, in the Latin alphabet. Now, how it was originally spelled in, Cyrillic characters, or more to the point in Yiddish, I don't know. But he very quickly was trying to shed ethnic background, so to speak. For one thing, the family had gotten married into by anarchists, and they were rather anti-religious. So the family, which had been Orthodox, I don't know that they were Haredi in any case, but the family became much more secularized and non-observant. So my grandfather changed it to Harry Pockras with the current spelling in Latin letters, and graduated from University of Cincinnati in 1921. Now, he'd gone through, during World War I, the Student Army Training Corps, which was the then equivalent to ROTC. And so he had military training, and he ended up with a career with the Army from that point till he fully retired in 1957. Some of that time he was a civilian employee. Some of that time he was a military officer in engineering. And because one could not advance very well before the Second World War, if one were Jewish, why not only did he change his name, which looked a little more Greek, but he listed in his service records that his religion was Unitarian. Furthermore, he and my grandmother, and then they had my dad, would attend Christmas and Easter services. And once he was moved to Huntington, West Virginia by the Army, they started sending my dad to Sabbath school, and they sent him with neighbors up the street, and the neighbors went to the local First Presbyterian Church, which was a Southern Presbyterian church. And in the mid to late 1930s, it was still quite conservative. In fact, that congregation right now is part of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, I believe. Huh. In any case, Dad heard the gospel. And I don't know that my grandparents ever heard it or certainly got it, but my dad did. And when he went away to engineering school, he'd started at Marshall University in Huntington, but transferred down the Ohio River to the University of Cincinnati. He started attending the local, what would be considered campus Presbyterian church. He and my mother got married when he still had a year of school left. It was a 5-year program, and with his transferring from Marshall, it went to 6 years. Mother had already completed her degree at Marshall University. They got married. He still had a year left, so he was kind of a commuter on weekends up and down the Ohio River on the Norfolk and Western Railroad. But after he graduated, he ended up with a job with American Bridge in Gary, Indiana. They were only there for a year or two and then moved back to Cincinnati when he got a job with the firm that he was with the rest of his working life. It's at this time that, my mother had been studying Judaism to look into moving over, so to speak, converting to Judaism. They were nothing, basically, my mother's family. And Dad decided, no, that's not the way we're going. Christianity is the truth. And so in 1953, they both made adult profession of faith. Both were baptized in that same Presbyterian church. In God's providence, their first kid, came along the next year. So I was born in God's kindness into a very new but Christian family. And my dad had a long career with this firm. And in not that particular congregation, we had a tragedy in the congregation when I was a little kid. The pastor killed himself. And my parents were quite shaken in their faith. We attended nowhere for a little while, but we moved from one suburb in Cincinnati to another. We were farther away from that church, but we were close to another suburban Presbyterian church. So we went there. That's where I basically grew up as far as church was concerned. So very quickly, this gets to, I've taken you through the Jewish background. I'd have mentioned that many of my relatives are still Jewish. Some of them are observant, but there are a number of us who are second cousins. We share common great-grandparents that are Christian in one sort of profession or another. That's kind of interesting to me. Furthermore, my own spiritual journey began when I was about 13. Now, I was born, like I say, in 1954. When I was around 13, I started becoming very aware of my sinfulness, what we would call in the Reform world, coming more under conviction. And so I was casting about all over the place for different ways to get to know God and have my sin forgiven. Actually, Dad would come into our bedrooms at night. I, by this point, had a sister, a couple years younger than I, a couple years younger than she, and then 4 years were two brothers. So he would come into my room and then to my brother's rooms and then to my sister's room, and we would all say the Lord's Prayer before going to sleep. Well, after Dad left me and went to the boys' room, I would move from saying my prayers to praying. And I'm sure, Greg, you know the difference.
Oh, yes.
And I would constantly be praying, God, forgive me my sin. I'd seen in a Gideon Bible that one could, if one were conscious of sin, one should read through Psalm 51. And I'd done that many times. And I won't go through many things that I did. I'll just say that I was looking around all over the place. I was getting into occult stuff and all that. Well, in 1969, I came to find out that my dad's firm, the principal of the firm, and a number of the engineers and architects were Christian people. And they had a contest for employees' kids. If one would read an approved Bible reading plan and then take a Moody Bible Institute correspondence course that the firm would pay for and sustain an interview with 3 Christian engineers, one would be sent off in the company plane at no expense for 2 weeks at a place called Word of Life Island in Schroon Lake, New York. Well, I thought, that sounds really fun, and maybe I can get to know something about God. Well, the Lord kept bumping me into the gospel. I was assigned to read the book of Genesis and the Gospel of John. The Moody Bible Institute correspondence course was on the gospel. I was doing reading in kind of far-right politics stuff, including John Stormer's None Dare Call It Treason. And there was a gospel presentation in there. So it's going wham, 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 hitting me. And my heart was like a steel ball bearing being dropped on a 6-foot thick concrete floor. Do you know how high that'll bounce? It makes no dent in the concrete and it just bounces right out. So I was getting hit with this, and I distinctly remember around this time, our pastor preaching on the only way into heaven was by God's grace. And I'd become a communicant member. I'd had the gospel there. So God is hitting me. The Spirit is hitting me. It's in my mind, but I didn't get it, and I didn't understand it. Well, I got through everything, and then I had a round of appendicitis. So I had a lot of time to lie there and think after my surgery. My pastor, during a visit, dropped off a copy of the Sermon on the Mount. You know, Greg, there are some people who say, well, I must be fine because I try to keep the Sermon on the Mount. Those people have no idea what they're saying. The Sermon on the Mount speaks to our hearts and shows the depth and the height and the breadth of sinfulness. And I knew I was sunk. So a lot of things to think about. Well, I ended up going to New York, and the first night there, Greg, the head of that ministry, a gentleman by the name of Jack Wordson, preached the gospel. And brother, my eyes were open. It's like the Apostle Paul, the scales fell down. I saw it. I understood it. I got it, that Jesus died for sinners. I was a sinner. He was just the Savior I needed. And I gave myself to the one who gave himself to me. Now, that was on July 19 in 1969. A couple short hours later, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And for the last 54 years, I've been telling people it was one small step for Neil, but one giant leap for me.
I like that.
So that carries you through to my conversion. I ended up, I started out at Washington and Lee University in Virginia because I thought God was calling me into law by my senior year in high school. And they had and have a really great law school, so I figured good pre-law program. It was during the first semester that I started becoming aware that maybe God was calling me to the ministry. So I talked to the campus chaplain, talked to my own pastors, talked to some of my own elders, was taken under care by session. Then, and I'd explain for non-Presbyterian people, that's the board of elders. And they had me come under care of Presbytery, which is kind of like a regional oversight. And I was going to be going to, well, I had to mention, I transferred to Miami University here in Ohio. And I was going to be going to Princeton Seminary in New Jersey. Through several different providences, that didn't work out. And so I ended up going to Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. And it was there that I moved from what's now the Presbyterian Church USA to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And then in my last year, I came into the Reformed Presbyterian Church in one of their Philadelphia congregations. And I have been in the RP Church since. Had another remarkable providence. I was just messing around in the library at Westminster one time, saw this little red book. And I didn't hear like the voice speaking to Augustine of Hippo, Tolle, but I just thought, well, what's this? And I looked at it and said, Associate Testimony. Well, I knew these people were related to Reformed Presbyterians. I was still OP at the time. I thought, I'll just take this out and read it. I read it. I thought, this is wonderful. So I made contact with the last remaining Associate Presbyterian contact and found out they no longer existed. They'd merged with the RPA Church in 1969, the same year I got saved. And when I'm talking here, this is 1978, I think. 1978. Maybe 1979. In any case, he said there's a minister in Western Pennsylvania that was in the AP church. Maybe you should contact him. Well, in God's providence, I was supposed to be an intern at the Grove City, Pennsylvania OP church for my second summer. And so I went and visited this other minister, and he had free books for me. And I read stuff and I thought, well, I can see my way going into the RPA church. Well, that was wonderful. I also remember at that time, Greg, I was desperately trying to find my true love. And I remember walking out of the pastor's study out in the backyard, and I said, are any of your members close by here? And this is just a little tiny town that makes Bell Center, which is about 800 people, look mammoth. There were only about 10 or 15 families in this little hamlet. And he pointed to this farm way across the fields and said, well, those people are. Well, that's where my wife was yet living, and she had just finished up her freshman year in college. So in any case, so I ended up, he asked me to come be his associate pastor after I graduated from seminary. So pulling this little red book off the shelf, which at the time was nothing significant to me, but God used this providence. God, of course, from the foundation of the world had planned this all out. So I pulled that off. From that, I got my denomination, I got my first pastorate, and I got my first and God willing only wife. So that was a great blessing. So let's see, it was after a few years, sadly, that pastor had a heart attack. And not long after that, I had to be looking for another call. So we ended up here in Bell Center, Ohio, and I've been here since. And that carries me up to today. What else would you like to ask me?
Well, that's really cool. What a cool story, and like really full of the providences of God. And I love that because I see that in my own life too. And I won't go through all the details of that right now, but just the way that the Lord moves us around in His will and brings us to where we need to be is really fun to kind of recount and listen to. So I do have a couple of questions. So first and foremost, I think I want to go back to near the very beginning. You were talking about your grandfather and that he had enlisted, I guess, as a Unitarian. And I'd want to hear more about that. Is there anything about that, or is there a reason that he listed that? Was there any sort of tiebacks or something when he was going into the military, thinking about having a Jewish identity? Was there any sort of, I don't know, is there anything significant about that, or was that just
Yeah, he was, as far as I can guess, I never talked with him much. He was in a car wreck and died only a few months after the Lord saved me. So I never really had a chance to talk to him, and I think he would have been rather impatient about it. In a weird providence, his own father was killed about 30 years before in a car wreck. So in any case, all I can think of, Greg, is that he didn't want to be a full-blown Christian, but wanted to kind of appear kind of like one. So wouldn't put down Jewish, but did put Unitarian. And he was probably about as pious as your normal Unitarian is or
sure.
isn't.
Right.
But there's one thing I guess I ought to add. There's not a lot of Jewish culture or anything that I grew up with. Dad had never been taught any Yiddish, though both my grandparents would have spoken it as little kids. And about the only Yiddish phrase I can ever remember my dad using that he'd apparently learned was "Mach's nicht," makes no difference. and kind of flip his hand back and forth. You know, my mother would be saying, "Lawrence, would you like for lunch some soup or a sandwich?" And he'd kind of wiggle his hand and say, "Max nicht," or "eh." You know, very Yiddish sort of things there. But
Sure.
now I love Jewish cuisine. We just had a Presbytery meeting a few weeks ago. No, it wasn't. It was a funeral of a pastor in Indianapolis, and there's a well-known deli there called Shapiro's. And I loaded up with all kinds of yummies because there are virtually no Jews around here in West Central Pennsylvania. Dear me, West Central Ohio. And so it's hard to find Jewish cuisine in restaurants or anything. There is a kosher aisle in our Kroger's and a kosher area in our Walmart, but that's about it. And the pickings are pretty slim. But I do like a lot of Jewish food. Some of these times I want to get to another Jewish style deli in Columbus called Katzinger's. But that's the Jewish culture that I have.
Sure. That's a good segue into my only other question that I really wanted to ask you was, so you have obviously a very clear Jewish heritage. How has that played into your love for and understanding of Jewish missions, and how does that kind of prompt you into evangelism of Jewish people?
Well, I don't have evangelism opportunities of Jewish people around here. There was a little more in Western Pennsylvania when we were there. In fact, the street that my wife and I lived on in the city of Newcastle had 3, quote, synagogues, unquote. Down the street from us was an Orthodox, a little bit beyond that, and opposite side of the street was a Messianic one. And then at the end of the street was a Reformed synagogue. So none of these congregations, sadly, this is 40 some years ago, none of these congregations exist anymore, though the buildings are there. But yeah, my desire is, well, I understand Romans 11, for example, in much the same way that John Murray did, that it's
Sure.
teaching that there is to be a widespread conversion of the Jews in a time to come. Until that time, of course, it's just a trickle, and blindness in part has come over Israel. Well, there is a priority to be a priority in our evangelism, and so that should be a priority for us because there is a trickle right now, and there are people in heaven from every tribe and tongue and family and nation. And this includes the descendants of Jacob. So, there are people who come to Christ because they're shown the gospel. They are shown Isaiah 53. They are shown other portions of scripture that point to the fact that Hamashiach is Jesus of Nazareth. It's not, I can't remember the name of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but in any case, there are some who think that the now deceased Lubavitcher Rebbe was Messiah, and no, he doesn't fit the description of Messiah in the Tanakh. It just doesn't work out. So Jesus is he, and I don't see. I've got to back up here, just kind of, sort of, Greg. I don't see that the ceremonial law, of course, still holds. And so I have very little patience with the so-called Hebrew roots movement,
Sure.
because all that's past. What we have is an abiding gospel. We don't have sacrifices anymore because Christ is our final sacrifice. We have no priest anymore because our mediatorial high priest is in the heavenlies. And he's in the Jerusalem, dear me, the heavenly temple. We have no need, nor we should not really be keeping the high days, the holy days, because they were all pointing to Christ's person and work. And you don't need the picture when the realities come. I sometimes use an illustration, Greg, of some years ago. I had a pretty ratty bathrobe, and my wife decided to get me a nice, thick, warm one for a present. Well, it was supposed to be coming in December 25th, and it didn't. So what she did was cut a picture of it out from the LL Bean catalog. She'd ordered it from Beans. I opened up a package, and here was this picture. All right, well, that's cool. And I was anticipating getting the robe, and sure enough, before New Year's, here it came. Now, I'd be pretty stupid, pretty silly, pretty ridiculous to say, I don't need this robe. I've got this beautiful picture. Okay, how stupid. So to hold to the old holy days, or try to, because it can't be done. We have no priests. We have no high priest. No one knows who the Kohen Gadol is. So we can't ordain Kohanim. We can't ordain Leviim. I can't serve as a Levite because I can't be ordained as such. But so we can't keep the days as they're told us to do in Scripture. All we have are Pharisaic, Talmudic workarounds, and they don't do what they're supposed to do. They don't do what it's thought they would do. It's stuff made up by the Pharisees and their heirs. So I've gone way off track, and I have no idea to get back where I was. So there is a desire, there should be a desire in all believers to see others coming to know Christ, not just because of the blessing it is to them, but because it glorifies God. I had a friend who's now with the Lord, a very well-known particular Baptist preacher. He wrote for Banner of Truth and all, and he said that the big motivation for missions is the glory of God. We don't want to just stop at saying we want people to know God for their sake. It's because God is worthy of being known. And we want him to be, if we love him, we want him to be loved by others. I don't get along well with people that don't like my wife. Thankfully, there aren't many. But if you don't like her, I don't like you very well. And even more so if, I want my God to be known. I want my God to be loved. I want my Savior to be exalted. Beyond that, I have no idea if I've answered your question.
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah. In fact, I think that's a really good place for us to leave off. And all the glory needs to go to God, and that's what we desire at CWI. That's what we desire to show people and to show our Jewish friends that their Messiah has come and that he's come to glorify God indeed. So I think it's a great place for us to wrap up. Phil, thank you so much for coming on to this podcast and talking with me today.
And thank you for the invitation. It's been long anticipated, and I'm glad we brought it to pass. Thanks, Greg.
No problem.